When you see the danger hundreds of thousands have faced, you might wonder, how can parents risk it all with their children? Well, they told me that Syria is simply far worse, far more dangerous.
The war-torn Middle East and Africa who have perished in a desperate attempt to find a new life in Europe. But even for those who survive, a rude awakening awaits in countries that are moving to close their doors.
Imagine yourself in our place. You are a human. We are a human. You have kids. We have kids.
Part 1. Conflict. The Syrian refugee crisis is a dynamic issue with complex origins. Historians disagree on the specific incident that erupted in the civil war. However, a mutual, agreed-upon factor marking the dawn of hostility can date back to the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. Also known as the Asia Minor Agreement, Great Britain and France created fears of influences, which occurs when independent nations influence a sovereign state through informal authority. The agreement was drafted and enacted in secrecy with Russia after the Ottoman Empire's defeat in World War I. The correlation between time and hostility following the agreement was due to France and Britain drafting nations out of the Ottoman Empire based on the distribution of resources and not the inhabitants of the Middle East. Disagreeing Islamic sects were grouped together, and the majority suppression occurred against the minority Islamic division, fostering hostility and a catalyst for revolution. In 1946, Syria became an independent republic with a parliamentary system, which was later replaced with a presidential government in 1958 due to Egyptian influence within Syria through the Union. In this successful coup d'etat of 1963, orchestrated by Hafez al-Assad, the dynastic cycle of presidential dictators emerged. Rebellions against the Syrian political system perpetuated the constant discourse. The gross disregard of human rights, constitutional legitimacy, or a democratic system have led to a constant rebellion against al-Assad by the Muslim Brotherhood calling for a jihad, which in Islamic law means armed violence against the non-believers, which is al-Assad due to his amending the constitution, implementing law that lifted the requirement for president to be a Muslim or other affected demographics desiring a shift in power. After Hafez died, a power vacuum formed within Syria, and his son claimed power, Bashar al-Assad. The Damascus Spring occurred in 2001, resulting in the imprisonment of activists advocating for democratic reform within Syria. More specifically, the creation of a government and the disbanding of the current regime. Bashar promised to reform it, but ultimately failed. A severe drought spanning 5 years, from 2006 to 2011, marked widespread crop failure and major inflation within urban centers and agricultural products. Violence. However, the inhumane and disregard for refugees arises due to the struggle for international support of human rights. Under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, every human is entitled to apply and experience the peace of asylum in the event of one's nation lacking the ability to protect it from its people. The first major recent occurrence of forced migration occurred in 2006 with the 5-year-long drought that displaced 1.6 million Syrians due to a lack of resources necessary for basic human life. Crop failure and livestock deaths resulted in extreme poverty and famine throughout the nation. Only 2 options remained: move into the cities and find new means of income, or move outside the region affected by the drought. Syria was anticipated to be independent of the Arab Spring due to its leader's violent method of citizen suppression. However, the drought was the spark that ignited the conflict within the nation that eventually emerged into the civil war. The usage of chemical weapons by al-Assad attests to the severity of the humanitarian crisis. Enacting militaristic oppression, Bashar al-Assad has launched canisters of nerve agents or other banned chemical weapons, grossly triggering violent seizures and death in any man, woman, or child, without the intention of only wounding or killing the opposing side. This is one of the major causes of the migration due to violence, and increases the plight of refugees on their journey. Part 3. Immigration Relief. The predominant organization supplying funding and establishing refugee camps is the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. Under the supervision of the High Commissioner and the United Nations, the Council is determined to bring attention to the epidemic resulting from the refugee migration due to a lack of resources, drastically increasing hostility, and the risk of death for these refugees fleeing war, death, and famine. Their solution consists of a 10-point objective for the refugee protection on their journey. About 1.5 million Syrians have migrated into Lebanon due to its proximity to Syria and the greater stability in the region. Most refugee immigration into the nation is undocumented through the porous border in the north through the Bekaa Valley. This is positive for refugees because it is easy to seek asylum in Lebanon. However, it's negative because the resources allocated are estimates and not exact statistics, which can result in decreased availability for different resources required by refugees. Other refugees can pay upwards of sums of tens of thousands of dollars for immigration into Europe through means of illegal vessels. However, a majority of the attempts are fruitless due to the fact that the Mediterranean coast is fortified with patrol. Therefore, multiple trips are almost always necessary to reach Europe. Once in Europe, few nations are actively accepting asylum applications from the Syrian refugee crisis, most notably Germany, Sweden, and Hungary. These applications are extensive and tremendously hard due to the language barrier and a variety of other factors against granting the refugees asylum. The Syrian refugee crisis is a dynamic and complex issue. The cycle of socialization is perpetuated within the war-torn nation of Syria and its neighboring nations. For example, the non-dominant sect of Islam are viewed as inferior for their form of faith. Women and children are subjected to the totalitarian control of the male patriarchy. Therefore, those who are not within the majority or do not conform to the subjective standards are faced with absolute dominance at the hands of those who allow themselves to rule and command. A term that can be adapted to this issue is institutionalized lyricism into institutionalized Islamophobia. The immigration system for many nations, including the United States, is disproportionately challenged based on factors of religion and nations of origin. This is another instance of institutionalized racism. In analyzing Tom Reagan's theory of rights, the current state of immigration policy violates the theory that experiencing subjects of life, meaning all conscious human beings, and no one is more significant than another. Chemical weapons, warring caliphates, and abysmal destruction create an intolerable environment. Therefore, the migration of refugees is extremely unethical because it sacrifices human identity for stagnant immigration policy. Furthermore, John Rawls' theory of rights is also disregarded because of the first and second principle of the veil of ignorance, which advocates for equal basic human rights for all and the limiting of social and economic inequalities. But by limiting immigration, the granting of asylum, the humanity of refugees is not considered. Therefore, based on the foundation of these ethical systems, the current stature of immigration in the United States is unethical for refugees applying for asylum. The governments of developed nations are not helping the refugees directly, resulting in the perpetuation of death and the dissolving of the refugee humanity. A disregard for the Kantian idea of categorical imperative 2 and the hypothetical imperative due to lack of identification of human identity.